Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 29th of December. Today I was planning to do a frontline update, but I will delay that to the next video because of reports that the Russian forces have launched their largest wave of airstrikes on Ukraine throughout the entire war. And this is backed up by a statement from the spokesman for the Ukrainian Air Force, for instance, who said that they'd never seen as many Russian targets being detected at a singular point in time throughout the entire course of the war. So this really is a significant development. So we're going to break everything down and look at some of the context for all this. And a big issue that I'm going to have to make clear from the beginning is that in terms of specific numbers for the number of missiles launched and intercepted, we really only could work with information from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, as whenever there is a certain wave of launches, it is reported on by the Ukrainian MOD and really by no other sort of independent third party source with less of an interest. And as a result, we do have to keep that in mind, and it makes the concrete numbers hard to believe. So we have to look more so at the trends for what the numbers are saying over an extended period of time. So if we do that and we look back at early 2023, we'll see that there was an uptake in strikes at the time. So I'm talking about the period in the winter and early spring of 2023. The Ukrainian MOD reported an increase in airstrikes, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and the two drones, of course, that were launched by Russia on Ukrainian cities on the rear. So you had a significant amount of strikes by the Russians on major cities like Kharkiv and their industrial facilities, Kiev, Odessa to a certain extent, Mykolaiv, Kryvyi, Dnipro in the center. You had, of course, in western Ukraine, again, a lot of strikes on certain airfields and on electrical substations, as at the time the Russians were trying to target certain elements of Ukraine's electrical grid, especially the substations, so like in Lutsk, in Lviv, Ternopil, etc., etc. So there was a wave of strikes, and this was during the time that Surovikin was overseeing the operations of the Russian forces in Ukraine. And since then, like going into summer of 2023, of course, there were still Russian airstrikes going on that were reported on a regular basis, not always by the Ukrainian MOD, but sometimes by local authorities. And that's really because the Russian forces decreased their amount of strikes on the rear on larger industrial targets or on large shipments of equipment, for instance, and focused more of their efforts on targeting clusters of forces and just engaging in frontline combat operations during the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And a big part of that is also because the Russian forces spent this period of time stockpiling on additional cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones, of course, in preparation for the winter season, of which we have now entered. And that is the explanation for now this massive uptake, as was reported by the Ukrainian MOD and as was seen in a massive influx of videos being posted by Ukrainians on social media from various cities showing the destruction caused by the most recent round of airstrikes. Now, as I said, the time frame for planning and coordinating such a large scale assault using these aerial resources really does take months, but nonetheless, it is interesting that this wave of strikes on the 29th occurred just 3 days after the Ukrainians did launch a strike of their own on the Russian Black Sea fleet. And so I was never able to talk about it, so we're going to just look at it quickly. On December 26th, 2:30 a.m., the Ukrainians launched what is likely to be Storm Shadow missiles towards the port of Feodosia, which is in Crimea over here. As you can see, I've zoomed in on it, and this is generally where the strike occurred. I don't have the specific geolocation at the moment. And what happened was one missile directly hit the Novocherkassk, which is the ship that was targeted in the strike, and that is a landing ship which was previously damaged, I believe, in March of 2022 in the beginning of the war and was docked in this area. And so that landing ship specifically, it did suffer some very significant damage and was partially submerged per satellite imagery, giving us an overhead view of that ship. And it's also being reported that there was at least one other of these cruise missiles that landed in the nearby waters. Unfortunately, we don't have concrete numbers on the total amount of casualties suffered in this specific attack. You had on the day of the strike by the Ukrainians, the Russian official sources in the region claiming that there was at least one person killed and two wounded in these strikes. But since then, you've had reports coming in from various Russian Telegram channels alleging that the number is as high as 38 Russian sailors killed and 29 injured. And then, in terms of a more maximalist rumor, and again, these are unconfirmed, yet a lot of the Ukrainian information space picking up on information that there were 74 sailors killed and 27 injured. So, we're going to really have to wait and see if we get a specific concrete number on that. But either way, this was a pretty significant strike by the Ukrainians on the Black Sea fleets, one which we hadn't really seen in the past few months. We did see some of these Storm Shadow attacks really throughout the summer, and it seems like now there was an increase of that specifically on the naval assets around Crimea. But in any case, let's go back to this specific round of strikes on December 29th by the Russians. So in terms of the specific missile used and the interception rate, unfortunately, as I said before, really the only source reporting on this in depth is the Ukrainian MOD. So I will just read what they say so you guys get an idea of what they claim to be the interception rates and what the number of total launched does appear to be. And so let's just go through that quickly. They report that there were 90 launched KH-101 missiles and 87 were intercepted. They claim that 0 out of 5 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles were intercepted. And then they claim that 0 out of 14 ballistic missiles, which does include S-300s, S-400s, and other such ballistic missiles. So they claim that none of those were intercepted throughout the barrage. They also claim that 0 out of 8 KH-22 anti-ship missiles were intercepted, 0 out of 5 KH-31Ps or KH-59 missiles were intercepted, and then they claim that 27 out of the 36 Geron-2 drones launched by the Russians were intercepted throughout the night. So when you do the numbers on that, that comes out to out of 158 missiles or drones that were launched, the Ukrainians claimed that 114 of them were intercepted, which means 48 of them were not, and likely were able to hit their intended targets, which would mean that's an interception rate of 72% being claimed by them. Now, regardless of the specific interception rate, it doesn't change the fact that there was some heavy damage incurred by a lot of the civilians in these cities. So, you had the Ukrainian Ministry of the Interior reporting that there were 30 killed throughout the airstrikes and 160 injured. And we don't have a full information on the specific targets, but we do have isolated incidents and a lot of videos that were released which show some of the damage, which was either caused by the missiles hitting the area directly or by debris which hit the specific areas, a lot of the times residential blocks, after they were intercepted by the Ukrainian air defense. So in terms of the most publicized targets that were hit throughout this wave of airstrikes on the Ukrainian media, you did have a lot of talk about the maternity hospital and shopping mall in Dnipro, which was hit. So this is one of the cities that was hit the hardest. They also had the metro station hit in Zaporozhye. And again, there's footage really for all of this, although I'm not going to show it here. Yeah, then you had also strikes on a school in Lviv, or at least damage being caused over there, either by the missiles or from the debris. And likewise, we also saw a lot of damage to apartment buildings in cities such as Odessa in the south over here. Now, in terms of certain military targets that could have been hit, it's much harder to get information on that from the Ukrainian side, as there are restrictions to sharing specific military information about Ukrainian positions, especially on the rear like that, where they could be exposed to Russian airstrikes. And so a lot of the time when I've seen videos of these smoke plumes forming following Russian strikes on the rear in Ukraine, there is a lot of blurring out to make it harder to get a specific geolocation. So again, it is very difficult to get particular numbers, and that's why we have to rely on Russian sources. So again, we don't have an ability to get independent information unless we were able to access satellite imagery of some of these facilities in areas where it's suspected that there were Russian airstrikes targeting, for instance, airfields or other military facilities. So I'll definitely be looking out for that to try to share that with you guys if that is actually accessed by anybody. But in terms of Russian claims for what they hit, there was reporting which comes from Rybar where they claimed there were strikes on Kharkiv, which were particularly large. And this is not surprising, as again, I said last year that there were significant strikes occurring over there when you had a large barrage of Russian missiles being launched, because there is a large industrial component in southern Kharkiv. And for instance, yesterday or today actually, it's being reported that there were Russian strikes on the Malaysia facilities, a large industrial area, including a tank production facility, which is being claimed to have been hit. And again, there was also a lot of electrical substations and power plants in this region. Interestingly, there was no reports about Russia targeting that yet, so we're gonna have to see if Russia does plan to do that in the future in some of the subsequent waves of strikes. In Odessa, it's also being claimed that some industrial facilities were targeted. Again, it's very broad generalizations. It's hard to get exact information as this just occurred over the last 24 hours. But in any case, you also had reports of targeting of specific warehouses in Kiev's Podilsky district. So let's go to that, which is located in the northwestern section of that city. And there were actually reports on the ground from the Ukrainian side of the Lukyansivska metro station being damaged due to the Russian airstrikes, which is located rather close to some significant industrial facilities that the Ukrainians have in the northwestern parts of the city. So there may have been warehouses in that region which the Russian sources claim to have targeted. Then Rybar also claims that Geron 2s attacked a Ukrainian airfield in Starokonstantiniv, which is again in western Ukraine. And this is very interesting because Rybar is the same source which alleges that F-16 parts have actually already been moved into western Ukraine, and that some of them are being stored in this same exact airbase. So I wonder if they'll release additional information about that. And you actually have Ukraine's 7th Tactical Aviation Brigade being stationed at this particular airfield. And you had additional strikes being reported on various cities such as Kherson in the south, Mykolaiv, Kryvyi Rih, Konotop, and Kropyvnytsky. Now, in response to this Russian strike over the past few hours, and I'm specifically referring to the night of December 29th going into the early morning of December 30th, the Ukrainians did retaliate by launching their own strikes on the Belgorod region, with a lot of videos coming out from Russian citizens in the city of Belgorod itself, showing some of the impacts and interceptions going on in the region. And so it's likely that the Ukrainians are shelling Belgorod with Smerch and Vilcha MLRS fire. And the Russian MOD, again, we have to rely on Ministry of Defense numbers, unfortunately. They're claiming that 13 rockets were intercepted so far and that at least one citizen was killed, with reports from the ground estimating that there were, at least 20, 25 explosions so far. So I believe that by tomorrow we'll get more concrete information about if anything actually was successful in landing and impacting any sort of sector of Belgorod, perhaps the industrial region of the city, for instance. And so we'll have to wait and see about that. But thank you guys so much for watching. Just as a final takeaway, I'd say if we're looking into the future with these Russian airstrikes and looking at their potential capabilities, I think it would be most important to look at whether they are interested in targeting Ukraine's electrical grid and whether they target a lot of the accumulation of aid, for instance, that's being organized in Western Ukraine, that's being stored over there, and that has been stored over there for a long time. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.